40 degrees below zero is cold enough to snap a solid steel axe handle in two. Breathing becomes a painful chore. Exposed skin freezes solid in a matter of minutes. When Clara Jenkins ran out of firewood during the absolute worst blizzard in regional history, the isolated residents of Pine Bluff assumed she was already dead. Smoke had stopped rising from her stone chimney on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday, thick white frost completely covered her windows from the inside out. Yet, when desperate neighbors finally trudged through waist-deep snow to recover her body, they didn't find a frozen corpse. Instead, they found blinding heat, a missing rug, and a wooden floor glowing a fiery, unnatural orange from underneath. Winter in Pine Bluff, Montana was never a gentle affair, but the blizzard of 1996 brought a different kind of malice. Meteorologists had warned of a pressure system dropping down from the Arctic, but warnings meant little to a community accustomed to fending for itself. The town was scattered, a loose collection of cabins and homesteads, connected by dirt roads that turned into impassable white oceans from November to April. Clara Jenkins lived 3 miles outside the main cluster of houses at the end of a winding logging trail. At 58 years old, she was fiercely independent. Her husband Richard had passed away a decade prior, leaving her the cabin, a modest pension, and a stubborn refusal to relocate to the city. Clara knew the land. She knew how to prepare. But no one could have prepared for the White Devil, the moniker locals eventually gave the storm that hit that January. The temperature plummeted 45 degrees in a single afternoon. The wind howled through the valley at 60 miles per hour, tearing shingles from roofs and snapping ancient pine trees like dried twigs. By nightfall on Sunday, the thermometer nailed to Clara's porch read -38. By Monday morning, the mercury had bottomed out into the bulb. It was at least 40 below. Inside her cabin, Clara wrapped herself in 3 layers of wool. Her breath hung in the air like pale ghosts. The draft from the poorly sealed windows was a continuous icy knife slicing through the room. But her biggest problem wasn't the wind. It was the woodpile. Richard used to chop enough cordwood to last through May, stacking it high against the eastern wall of the cabin where the snowdrifts were usually lightest. Clara had hired a local boy, a teenager named Toby Henderson, to do the chopping that autumn. Toby had been lazy. He had stacked the front row beautifully, but behind it the pile was mostly hollow, filled with loose brush and rotting birch that burned up in minutes without producing any real heat. Clara hadn't discovered the deception until the storm was already upon her. By Monday evening, she was burning the last of the seasoned oak. Panic, a slow and cold serpent, began to coil in her stomach. The nearest neighbor was Arthur Pendleton, an old Korean War veteran who lived a mile and a half down the logging road. Walking there in a whiteout at 40 below was a guaranteed death sentence. The snow was easily 4 feet deep and drifting higher. There were no cell phones. The landline had gone dead hours after the first heavy snowfall, the copper wires snapping under the weight of the ice somewhere down the valley. Clara sat in her rocking chair, huddled under 2 heavy quilts, watching the embers in the cast-iron stove fade from bright orange to a dull, dying red. The silence of the cabin was oppressive, broken only by the shrieking wind outside. She began to systematically dismantle her life to stay warm. First went the wooden dining chairs. She took an axe to them in the center of the living room, splintering the oak and feeding the pieces into the stove. They burned fast and hot, providing a temporary reprieve. Next went the coffee table, a cheap pine thing she'd bought at a flea market in Billings. She threw in old magazines, paperback novels, and eventually the heavy wooden shelves that held them. But by Tuesday morning, the fuel was gone. The storm raged on, completely indifferent to her survival. The temperature inside the cabin began to plummet, dropping below freezing. Frost crept up the inside of the glass panes, crystalline ferns of ice that blocked out the pale gray daylight. Clara filled a cast-iron pot with snow and set it on the dying embers to melt, knowing she needed water as much as heat. She looked around the room. The walls were solid log. She couldn't chop them down without bringing the roof down on her head. The floorboards were thick tongue-and-groove pine securely nailed to the joists. She had no tools to pry them up, and even if she did, exposing the crawl space would only let the freezing air in faster. Clara moved her mattress off the bed frame and dragged it directly in front of the cold stove, creating a small cocoon with her blankets. As lethargy began to set in, the first insidious sign of severe hypothermia, she closed her eyes and prepared for the inevitable sleep from which she knew she would not wake. A mile and a half away, Arthur Pendleton stood by his living room window, a steaming mug of black coffee in his gnarled hand. His own wood stove was roaring the heat, a comfortable counterpoint to the terrifying chill radiating from the glass. He wiped a patch of condensation away and peered out into the gray, churning landscape. Through a brief break in the driving snow, he could just barely make out the distant ridge where Clara's cabin sat. For 30 years, Arthur had checked that ridge every morning during winter. Seeing the thin gray ribbon of smoke rising from Richard and Clara's chimney was a silent reassurance, a neighborly check-in that required no words. On Tuesday morning, the sky above the ridge was empty. Arthur frowned, leaning closer to the glass. "Jacob," he called out. His son, a broad-shouldered man of 32 who had come to stay for the winter, walked out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. "What is it, Pop?" "Look up at the Jenkins place," Arthur said, pointing a stiff finger. "You see anything?" Jacob squinted through the frost-rimmed glass. He watched for several minutes, waiting for the wind to shift the curtain of snow. Finally, he shook his head. "No smoke. You sure she's up there?" "She didn't go to town," Arthur said, his voice grim. "Saw her on the porch Sunday before the front hit. Her old truck is still buried in the driveway. Nobody drives out of this without a plow." "Maybe she's sleeping in," Jacob suggested, though the lack of conviction in his voice was obvious. "In this kind of cold, you didn't sleep in. You fed the fire every 3 hours, or you froze. She's out of wood," Arthur concluded, a heavy knot of dread forming in his chest. "I told her that Henderson boy was cheating her on the cords. I should have gone up there and checked the pile myself." "Pop, we can't go out in this," Jacob warned, stepping back from the window. "It's 42 below. The wind chill is pushing -70. The snow is waist high. We wouldn't make it halfway up the logging road before we lost the trail and froze to death." Arthur knew his son was right. Going out in a whiteout was suicide. But the thought of Clara alone in a freezing cabin gnawed at his conscience. They decided to wait. Perhaps she was burning coal, which produced less visible smoke. Perhaps the wind was just instantly dispersing it. They would wait 24 hours. If the storm broke, they would take the snowmobiles. Wednesday came and went. The storm did not break. The wind screamed like a wounded animal, and the snow piled in immense drifts against Arthur's house, completely burying the front door. The silence from the ridge remained unbroken. By Thursday morning, the wind finally began to die down. The sky, previously a bruised and chaotic gray, cleared to a brilliant, blinding blue. The sun reflected off the pristine, untouched snow, but it offered no warmth. The temperature stubbornly remained at 35 below zero. "Get your gear on," Arthur told Jacob, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We're going up there." They spent an hour digging the snowmobiles out of the shed. The engines sputtered and whined in protest against the thick freezing oil, but eventually they roared to life. They packed shovels, heavy wool blankets, a thermos of boiling water, and a first aid kit. Arthur also packed a heavy canvas tarp. He didn't say what it was for, but Jacob knew. It was to wrap the body. Back in the cabin, Tuesday night had blurred into Wednesday for Clara. The cold was a physical weight pressing down on her chest. Her extremities had gone past numbness into a strange burning ache, and then finally settled into a terrifying lack of sensation. She had stopped shivering, a medical red flag she recognized, but was too exhausted to care about. She drifted in and out of consciousness, hallucinating snippets of her past. She heard Richard chopping wood outside. She heard the kettle whistling. But every time she opened her eyes, she was met with the harsh, frost-covered reality of her dark living room. It was sometime on Wednesday afternoon when she noticed it. She was lying on the floor, her cheek pressed against the rough wool of her blanket. The cabin was utterly silent. But beneath the blanket, beneath the thick braided rug that covered the center of the room, there was a sensation. It was incredibly faint. At first, she thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her, a final merciful delusion before death. But as she lay there perfectly still, she realized it was real. The floorboards directly beneath her were not freezing. Clara forced her eyes open. Her eyelashes were caked with ice from her own breath. She weakly pushed the heavy blanket aside and ran her bare, stiff hand across the wood. The floor near the walls was like a block of ice, but in the exact center of the room, roughly a 4-by-4-foot square, it was tepid. Not hot, not even particularly warm, but significantly above freezing. A sudden sharp spike of adrenaline pierced through her lethargy. She pushed herself up onto her hands and knees. Her joints screamed in protest. She grabbed the edge of the large braided rug and with the last ounces of her strength rolled it back. The exposed pine boards looked completely normal. But as she placed her palms flat against them, she felt a distinct, steady vibration. And the warmth was real. It was radiating from beneath the cabin. Clara remembered Richard talking about the foundation years ago. The cabin was built in the 1920s, long before they bought it. Richard had mentioned that it sat on a natural limestone shelf and that the original builders had capped an old deep earth shaft right under the floor to keep the cabin level. "Probably an old prospector's bore hole," Richard had laughed. "Nothing down there but dirt and disappointment." But there was something down there now, and it was generating heat. The ride up the logging road was treacherous. Arthur and Jacob had to abandon the snowmobiles a quarter-mile from Clara's cabin, where a massive hemlock tree had fallen across the path, completely buried in snow. They strapped their snowshoes on and began the grueling trek, fighting through drifts that reached their chests. The air was so cold it burned their lungs with every inhalation. Ice formed on Arthur's beard and eyebrows. Neither man spoke. They needed all their oxygen just to keep moving forward. When Clara's cabin finally came into view, it looked like a tomb. The roof was covered in 3 feet of snow. The windows were entirely opaque, frosted over thick and white. The chimney was capped with a delicate cone of undisturbed snow, confirming what Arthur had feared. There hadn't been a fire in that stove for days. As they approached the front porch, however, Jacob stopped dead in his tracks and grabbed his father's arm. "Pop, look!" Jacob pointed toward the base of the cabin. Arthur squinted through the blinding glare of the sun. The cabin sat on a raised stone foundation. All around the perimeter, the snow was piled high, burying the stones. But in the center, directly under the living room, there was a perfect semicircular sinkhole in the snow. The snow hadn't just blown away, it had melted. There was a clear gap between the frozen drifts and the stone foundation, and the exposed rocks were dry. "What the hell?" Arthur muttered, his voice muffled by his scarf. They hurried to the porch, kicking away the snow to reach the door. Arthur pounded a heavy mittened fist against the wood. "Clara, Clara, it's Arthur. Are you in there?" Silence. "The door's frozen shut," Jacob said, pulling on the handle. "The lock isn't engaged, but the ice has it sealed." Arthur stepped back, lowering his shoulder. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. Both men slammed their weight against the heavy oak door. With a loud crack like a rifle shot, the ice shattered and the door burst open. They stumbled into the entryway, expecting the air inside to be a stagnant, frozen crypt. Instead, a wave of intense, suffocating heat washed over them. It was easily 90 degrees inside the cabin. The air was thick, smelling strongly of sulfur, ancient earth, and scorched pine. "Gara." Arthur gasped, pulling down his scarf to breathe in the sweltering air. The living room was in shambles. Splintered furniture lay scattered near the cold wood stove. The braided rug had been shoved into a corner, but it was the center of the room that made both men freeze in absolute disbelief. A 4-by-4 section of the heavy pine floorboards had been violently pried up. An iron crowbar lay discarded nearby. From the gaping hole in the floor, an intense, terrifyingly beautiful light spilled into the dim cabin. It was a deep, pulsating orange, like looking directly into the belly of a blast furnace. The light cast wild, shifting shadows across the log walls, and sitting on the edge of the hole, her legs dangling down into the blinding glow, was Clara Jenkins. She had shed her winter coats and heavy wool blankets. She was wearing only a light cotton sweater and jeans, her face flushed red from the immense heat. She looked up as Arthur and Jacob burst in a weary but triumphant smile cracking across her face. "Took you boys long enough?" She rasped, her voice hoarse from dehydration and breathing the dry, heated air. "Clara, what in God's name?" Arthur whispered, taking a cautious step toward the glowing hole. The heat radiating from it was intense enough to make his skin prickle beneath his winter gear. He dropped to his knees beside her and looked down. He expected to see fire. He expected to see a burning basement, but what he saw defied all logic. About 8 feet below the floor, joists the earth opened up into a massive cavernous shaft. The walls of the shaft were sheer black rock, but deep down, perhaps 50 feet below the rock, wasn't black. It was glowing. Veins of brilliant molten orange crisscrossed the stone, pulsing with a terrifying subterranean energy. It looked like the surface of the sun had been buried beneath the limestone shelf. A steady updraft of blistering hot air rushed up the shaft, funneling directly into the cabin. "It's a coal seam," Clara explained casually, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Richard always said this place sat on old mining land. Turns out there's a deep vein of coal down there. It must have caught fire decades ago. It's been burning underground this whole time, slowly eating its way toward the surface." Jacob stared down into the abyss, his eyes wide. Underground coal fires were legendary in the region, accidental ignitions from old mining operations that could burn for a century, impossible to extinguish, turning the ground above them into a toxic, heated wasteland. The floor was getting warm. Clara continued, her eyes reflecting the orange glow. "I pried up the boards. The old stone cap Richard talked about. It was just a thin layer of shale. I cracked it with the crowbar and the heat just poured out. It saved my life, Arthur. The devil himself heated my cabin." Arthur pulled off his heavy mittens, staring in awe at the hellish glow beneath the floorboards. Clara was alive, sitting in a 90-degree cabin, while the world outside was locked in a frozen apocalypse. It was a miracle, but a highly dangerous one. "Clara," Arthur said slowly, looking at the charred edges of the floor joists nearest the hole. "This is incredible. But that heat is rising. The wood under your house is drying out. If we don't get you out of here, this cabin isn't going to freeze." Jacob nodded grimly, noticing a thin wisp of smoke curling up from a nearby pine beam. "He's right, Mrs. Jenkins. It's going to burn to the ground." The reality of the situation settled over the small living room like a suffocating blanket. The heat, initially a miraculous savior, had transformed into a lethal threat. The pine floorboards, dried out by decades of Rocky Mountain winters, were baking. The ambient temperature in the cabin was rising by the minute as the draft from the exposed shaft pulled more of the subterranean inferno upward. Arthur Pendleton wiped a thick layer of sweat from his brow, his heavy winter gear now acting as a torturous oven. "We have to move Clara. Now. This wood is practically kindling and you're sitting directly above the match." Clara shook her head, her eyes wide with a sudden fierce panic. She shrank away from the open door, where the Arctic air was currently warring with the 90-degree heat of the room. "No, I can't go out there, Arthur. It's death out there. It's -40. I'll freeze before we make it to the tree line." "You'll burn if you stay." Jacob interjected, his voice sharp with urgency. He pointed to the exposed joist nearest the gaping hole. The wood was no longer just smoking. It was blackening, charring at the edges. Small, glowing embers of airborne ash were floating up from the depths of the coal seam, swirling in the thermal updraft like fireflies. If one of them landed on the dry quilts Clara had pushed aside, the room would go up in seconds. Arthur knelt in front of her, ignoring the blistering heat radiating against his knees. "Listen to me, Clara. You've been in this oven for a day. Your core temperature is high, your pores are open, and you're sweating. If you walk out that door right now, the shock alone could stop your heart. We aren't going to let you walk. Jacob, get the tarp. Get the blankets from the sled." Jacob didn't waste a second. He bolted out the front door, plunging back into the knee-deep snow on the porch to retrieve the heavy canvas tarp and the extra wool blankets they had strapped to the snowmobiles. Inside, Arthur began assembling a survival pod. "We're going to wrap you up tight, Clara, like a cocoon. We'll trap this hot air inside the blankets with you." He grabbed the heavy quilts Clara had used during the freezing days and dragged them closer to the hole, letting the rising heat bake the fabric until it was hot to the touch. When Jacob returned with the freezing canvas tarp, Arthur laid it flat on the floor, away from the hole, then layered the piping hot quilts on top. "Lie down," Arthur commanded. Clara looked at the dark, swirling void of the coal fire one last time. It had been her salvation, a terrifying anomaly of nature that had spared her from an icy tomb. Leaving it felt like a betrayal of the earth itself, but the smell of scorching pine was growing unbearable. She crawled onto the heated blankets. Jacob and Arthur worked with synchronized, desperate speed. They wrapped the hot quilts tightly around her, tucking the edges under her body to seal in the warmth. Then they brought the heavy canvas tarp up and over, lashing it tightly with a length of nylon rope Jacob had brought in his pack. The canvas would act as a windbreaker, shielding the porous wool from the -70 wind chill outside. "Leave an opening for her mouth," Arthur instructed, his breathing heavy. The exertion and the extreme heat was taking its toll on the older man. His face was flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. "She needs to breathe, but cover her nose. The air out there will freeze her lungs." As Jacob secured the final knot, a loud, sharp crack echoed through the cabin. Both men jumped. The floorboard closest to the hole had split right down the middle, a jagged line of glowing orange creeping along the fracture. The ambient temperature spiked. The draft from the open front door was feeding oxygen down into the shaft, acting like a bellows on a forge. The underground fire was raging upward, eager to consume the sudden influx of fresh air. "It's catching!" Jacob yelled over the roar of the rushing wind and heat. "Grab the front of the tarp, Pop. We have to drag her." Arthur grabbed the thick reinforced grommets at the head of the canvas tarp. Jacob took the sides. With a synchronized heave, they pulled Clara across the floor. The heavy canvas slid across the rough pine, dragging her toward the frozen doorway. Just as they crossed the threshold onto the porch, a sudden whoosh sounded behind them. Arthur glanced over his shoulder. The braided rug pushed into the corner of the room had burst into violent yellow flames. The heat from the floor had finally pushed the fabric past its ignition point. Within seconds, the fire leaped to the dry log walls. The cabin was lost. "Pull!" Arthur screamed. They dragged Clara's canvas cocoon down the wooden steps, plunging into the waist-deep snow. The transition from the blazing inferno of the cabin to the absolute frozen wasteland of the mountain ridge was instantaneous and brutal. The cold hit them like a physical blow. The moisture on Arthur's face, sweat from the 90-degree cabin, froze instantly, turning into a rigid mask of ice against his skin. His wet clothing grew stiff in seconds, the sudden plunge in temperature threatening to send his aging body into shock. Beneath the heavy canvas, Clara felt the terrifying bite of the Arctic air seep through the small breathing hole they had left for her. Even with the layers of hot wool pressed against her body, the cold was an aggressive living entity trying to claw its way inside. She squeezed her eyes shut and focused on breathing the icy air burning her throat with every inhalation. "Keep moving!" Jacob shouted. The wind was whipping across the ridge, picking up the loose surface snow and throwing it against them like shattered glass. Dragging the tarp through 4 feet of powder was an agonizing endeavor. Without runners or a smooth sled bottom, the canvas plowed into the drifts, acting like an anchor. Jacob, being the younger and stronger of the two, took the brunt of the weight, wrapping the nylon rope around his waist and leaning forward like a sled dog. Arthur pushed from behind his snowshoes, sinking deep with every step. They aimed for the tree line where they had been forced to leave the snowmobiles. It was only a quarter of a mile, but in these conditions, it felt like a marathon across a frozen ocean. 50 yards from the cabin, the ground beneath Jacob suddenly shifted. He had just planted his left snowshoe when a sickening crunch echoed beneath the snowpack. There was no time to react. The white surface simply gave way. Jacob plummeted downward, letting out a sharp cry as he vanished up to his chest in a dark, steaming crater. The rope snapped taut, yanking the tarp forward and nearly pulling Arthur off his feet. "Jacob!" Arthur bellowed, scrambling forward on his hands and knees. Jacob was wedged in a narrow, jagged fissure. The snow around the edges of the hole was melting rapidly, turning into slick, dangerous ice. Steam, thick, sulphurous, and incredibly hot, was pouring out of the void around him. The ground, Jacob coughed, swatting at the thick steam to see his father. The fire isn't just under the cabin, Pop. The vein runs under the yard. It's melting the snow from the bottom up. The whole field is hollow. Arthur's heart pounded against his ribs. The coal seam, burning for decades, had created a labyrinth of unstable caverns beneath the permafrost. The immense heat radiating upward was melting the deep snowpack from beneath, creating massive invisible air pockets covered only by a fragile crust of surface snow. They were navigating a frozen minefield. "Give me your hand," Arthur yelled, dropping flat onto his stomach to distribute his weight across the fragile snow. He reached down into the steaming crater. Jacob unhooked the drag rope from his waist, ensuring Clara wouldn't be pulled down if the shelf collapsed further. He reached up, grasping his father's thick leather mitten. With a heavy groan of exertion, Arthur pulled. Jacob kicked his boots against the rocky sides of the fissure, fighting the suction of the melting ice. Inch by agonizing inch, he dragged himself out of the steaming hole, collapsing onto the solid snow beside the tarp. "We can't go straight," Jacob panted, rolling onto his back and staring up at the blinding, uncaring sky. "We have to follow the tree line. The roots keep the earth packed tighter. The open ground is a trap." They rerouted, dragging Clara's cocooned body toward the edge of the dense pine forest. It took them an excruciating 45 minutes to cover the remaining distance to the fallen hemlock tree. By the time the dark, angular shapes of the snowmobiles came into view, Arthur was staggering. His chest heaved with shallow, painful gasps, and his vision was swimming with dark spots. "Get them started," Arthur wheezed, leaning heavily against the frozen trunk of the hemlock. "I'll tie her to the rear rack." Jacob nodded, stumbling toward his machine. The engines had been sitting idle in 35 below zero temperatures for nearly 2 hours. The oil had likely turned to sludge. Jacob gripped the pull cord of the primary snowmobile, braced his boot against the tread, and yanked with all his remaining strength. The engine sputtered, gave a weak, pathetic cough, and died. Panic, colder and sharper than the wind, spiked in Jacob's chest. He pulled again, and again. On the 5th pull, the engine caught, roaring to life in a cloud of blue exhaust. He quickly moved to the second machine, praying the luck would hold. It took 8 agonizing pulls, stripping the last reserves of energy from his arms, but the second engine finally screamed awake. Meanwhile, Arthur had managed to wrestle the heavy canvas cocoon onto the extended cargo rack of his snowmobile. He used multiple bungee cords and heavy straps to lash the tarp down securely. He tapped the top of the canvas near where he knew Clara's face was. "Hold on, Clara. We're getting you home." There was no answer, just the steady, rhythmic trembling of the tarp that told him she was still breathing, still fighting the creeping lethargy of the cold. The ride back down the logging trail was a blurred nightmare of speed ice and screaming wind. Jacob took the lead, using the headlight of his snowmobile to cut through the stark, blinding glare of the afternoon sun reflecting off the snow. He navigated the treacherous path with reckless desperation, pushing the machine as fast as he dared without sending it careening off the sheer drop-offs that bordered the trail. Behind him, Arthur clung to the handlebars of his own machine, his knuckles white beneath his mittens. Every jolt, every bump in the uneven snow sent a spike of anxiety through him. He was terrified the straps holding Clara would snap, or worse, that the extreme shock of the elements had already taken her. The wind chill on the moving vehicles was astronomical. It felt as though invisible razors were slicing through their heavy canvas coats. Arthur's chest burned. His heart, an old muscle forced to endure the stress of a man half his age, was beating an erratic, terrifying rhythm. He ignored the pain radiating down his left arm, focusing entirely on the rear bumper of Jacob's snowmobile. Just keep moving. Just keep the engine running. The trail seemed endlessly longer on the descent. Fallen branches buried under the fresh snow acted like speed bumps, jarring the heavy machines. The silence of the wilderness was completely drowned out by the whining engines and the howling wind. After what felt like hours, the dense canopy of pines finally broke. The trail widened, and the familiar shape of Arthur's 2-story farmhouse came into view, a beacon of safety amidst the endless white ocean. Smoke was pouring from the stone chimney, a beautiful thick gray plume that promised heat, survival, and life. Jacob didn't bother following the driveway. He drove his snowmobile straight across the buried front lawn, coming to a sliding halt just feet from the front porch. Arthur pulled in beside him seconds later, cutting the engine immediately. "Get her inside!" Arthur yelled, his voice cracking from exhaustion. Jacob was already tearing at the bungee cords. They hauled the heavy frozen canvas package off the cargo rack. It was noticeably stiffer now, the moisture that had escaped the hot blankets having frozen the outer tarp into a rigid shell. They practically kicked the front door open, rushing into the mudroom and then into the living room where Arthur's wood stove was roaring. They dropped the cocoon onto the braided rug, a harsh reminder of the one that had just sparked an inferno. Jacob drew his hunting knife and carefully sliced the nylon ropes, peeling back the stiff frozen canvas. Clara lay beneath the hot quilts, which were now lukewarm to the touch. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with a frightening shade of blue, but her chest was rising and falling steadily. She blinked against the sudden bright light of the living room, a violent shiver suddenly racking her entire body. "She's shivering," Jacob said, profound relief washing over his face. "That's good. Her body is fighting back. The shock didn't shut down her system." "Get the hot water bottle," Arthur commanded, collapsing into his armchair, his legs completely giving out beneath him. "Get some warm broth going. Slowly, don't shock her stomach." While Jacob rushed to the kitchen, Arthur sat in the chair, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He pressed a hand to his chest, waiting for the burning sensation to subside. It slowly did, replaced by an overwhelming, bone-deep exhaustion. They had done it. They had defied the mountain, the storm, and the fire. Clara let out a long, rattling sigh from the floor, pulling the blankets tighter around her neck. "Arthur," she whispered weakly. "I'm here, Clara. You're safe. You're in my house." She turned her head slightly, looking toward the large picture window that faced the distant ridge. "My home." Arthur followed her gaze. Miles away, standing out against the brilliant, painful blue of the freezing sky, a massive pillar of thick black smoke was rising from the ridge. As they watched, a sudden bright flare of orange erupted at the base of the smoke plume, visible even from a mile and a half away. The underground demon had fully claimed the cabin. The dry logs, baked for days by the subterranean heat, were burning with explosive ferocity. Against the stark white canvas of the snow-covered mountain, the fire looked like a tiny, furious star consuming the only evidence that Clara Jenkins had ever lived on that ridge. Arthur watched the flames, the irony of it all settling heavily on his tired shoulders. The cold had threatened to kill her, but the fire had saved her life, only to destroy everything she owned. "It's gone, Clara," Arthur said softly, his voice thick with emotion. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "But you're not. You're right here." Clara watched the distant glow for a long time. The violent shivering slowly subsided as the warmth of Arthur's home permeated the blankets. She closed her eyes, the terrifying roar of the coal seam still echoing faintly in her memory. "It kept me warm, Arthur," she murmured, drifting into the first safe, natural sleep she had known in days. "It kept me warm until you came." Clara Jenkins did not wake up the next morning, nor the morning after that. The severe thermal shock, combined with extreme dehydration and the early stages of hypothermia, forced her body into a deep defensive coma. When she finally opened her eyes, the log walls of Arthur Pendleton's farmhouse had been replaced by the sterile, aggressively bright ceiling tiles of the Bozeman General Hospital Intensive Care Unit. The steady, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor provided a stark contrast to the howling wind that still echoed in her memory. Her hands were heavily bandaged, the skin treated for second-degree burns, sustained from gripping the scalding crowbar and the hot floorboards. Her toes conversely throbbed with the agonizing pins and needles sensation of severe frostnip. Arthur was asleep in a vinyl armchair in the corner of the room, his chin resting on his chest, looking 10 years older than he had just a week prior. "Arthur," Clara croaked. Her throat felt as though it had been scoured with coarse sandpaper. The old veteran jolted awake, his hand instinctively going to the breast pocket of his flannel shirt before his eyes focused on the bed. A profound, weary smile spread across his face. He pushed himself out of the chair joints popping and moved to her bedside. "Well, look who finally decided to join the land of the living," Arthur said softly, pouring a small paper cup of water from a plastic pitcher. He guided a straw to her cracked lips. "Take it slow. The doctor said you'd be thirsty." Clara drank greedily, the cool water soothing the raw lining of her throat. "How long?" 4 days, Arthur replied, pulling up a stool. "The storm broke late Thursday night. They got the plows up the county road by Friday afternoon. An ambulance managed to reach my place shortly after. You've been out cold ever since." Clara closed her eyes, the terrifying images of the glowing abyss beneath her floorboards rushing back. "My cabin." Arthur's expression sombered. He looked down at his calloused hands. "There's nothing left, Clara. The fire department couldn't even get close. Once that underground seam caught the oxygen from the surface, it turned the entire ridge into a blast furnace. The State Forestry Department and the EPA are out there now. They've cordoned off a 3-mile radius." Before Clara could fully process the absolute loss of her home, the heavy wooden door of her hospital room clicked open. A man in a crisp, dark green uniform stepped inside, accompanied by a civilian wearing wire-rimmed glasses and carrying a thick manila folder. "Mrs. Jenkins, I'm Chief Miller with the County Fire Authority," the uniformed man said, gently removing his hat. "And this is Dr. Thomas Weaver. He's a geological surveyor with the state. We're glad to see you awake. We were hoping we could ask you a few questions about what happened up on that ridge." Arthur bristled, slightly protective of his neighbor. "She just woke up, Chief. Can't this wait?" It's all right, Arthur," Clara whispered, adjusting the motorized bed to sit up slightly. "I want to know what happened to my home." Dr. Weaver stepped forward, opening his folder. "Mrs. Jenkins, your survival is nothing short of an anomaly. We've been studying the site for the past 48 hours. Your cabin was built directly over what we are now calling the Pine Bluff Seam. It's a massive deposit of sub-bituminous coal. Judging by the core samples we managed to extract from the perimeter, this seam has been burning slowly for at least 70 years. 70 years? Clara asked, bewildered. Richard and I lived there for decades. The ground was never warm. The snow always stuck. Underground coal fires are incredibly insidious, Dr. Weaver explained, adjusting his glasses. They burn deep, sometimes hundreds of feet down, following the oxygen flow through microscopic fissures in the bedrock. They can smolder at low temperatures for generations. But recently, likely due to a minor seismic shift in the limestone shelf last fall, the fire found a new vertical shaft. It began burning its way straight up right beneath your foundation. Chief Miller leaned against the footboard of her bed. Mrs. Jenkins, the fire that burned your house down isn't the most shocking part of this investigation. It's the reason you are currently alive to talk to us about it. Clara frowned. I'm alive because I pried up the floorboards and found the heat. Yes, but you shouldn't have been conscious to do that, Dr. Weaver corrected. He pulled a glossy photograph from his folder and handed it to Arthur, who held it up for Clara to see. It was an aerial shot of her property. Where her cabin used to be, there was now a terrifying blackened crater, venting thick white smoke into the winter air. The surrounding snow had melted away, revealing scorched earth. A coal fire of that magnitude produces massive amounts of carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide. Dr. Weaver continued, colorless, odorless, and utterly lethal. As the fire approached the surface over the last month, those gases were seeping upward, filtering through the porous stone foundation and pooling under your floorboards. Clara felt a cold chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the blizzard. We interviewed the young man who chopped your wood, Chief Miller said, his tone tightening. Toby Henderson. He confessed that he severely shortchanged you on your cordwood this season, filling the back of the pile with rotten brush. Anger, hot and sudden, flared in Clara's chest. That boy left me to freeze. He did. Chief Miller nodded. And ironically, his laziness saved your life. Clara and Arthur stared at the fire chief in stunned silence. Vriti. If Toby had given you the proper amount of seasoned hardwood, Dr. Weaver explained, you would have kept your cast iron stove burning hot throughout the entirety of the blizzard. You would have kept your windows sealed and your house securely locked tight against the draft to retain the heat. If you had done that, the carbon monoxide seeping up from the floorboards would have been trapped inside the airtight cabin. The terrifying realization washed over Clara. You would have fallen asleep in your rocking chair on Monday night, Chief Miller said softly, and you never would have woken up. The gas would have asphyxiated you long before the floorboards ever got hot enough to notice. But because you ran out of wood, your fire died. And when the fire died, Dr. Weaver pointed out, the extreme negative pressure of the Arctic storm outside began pulling the air from inside your cabin out through the chimney and the poorly sealed window panes. The freezing wind essentially ventilated the cabin, sucking the deadly carbon monoxide up and out, keeping the air just breathable enough. You were freezing to death, Mrs. Jenkins, but that freezing draft is the only reason you didn't suffocate. It was a paradox of survival that defied all logic. The very thing that had brought her to the brink of death, the lack of firewood and the penetrating cold, had protected her from an invisible subterranean assassin. 3 weeks later, the brutal grip of winter loosened its hold on Pine Bluff. The temperatures rose into the upper 20s, and the colossal snowdrifts began their slow weeping melt. Clara was discharged from the hospital with a clean bill of health, though her hands were still wrapped in protective gauze. Having nowhere else to go, she moved into the guest room of Arthur's farmhouse. Jacob had already retrofitted the downstairs bathroom with grab bars and brought in a more comfortable mattress. Despite the warmth of the Pendleton home, Clara felt a hollow, aching void in her chest. Every photograph of Richard, every heirloom handed down from her grandmother, her wedding ring, which she took off to wash dishes the night before, the storm, all of it was gone, swallowed by the earth. On a bright, painfully clear Tuesday morning, Clara asked Arthur to take her up the logging road. The state has it barricaded. Clara. Arthur warned, gently pouring coffee in the kitchen. It's not a pretty sight. It might be better to remember it how it was. I need to see it, Arthur. Clara insisted, her voice possessing a quiet, unyielding steel. A captain doesn't abandon a sunken ship without seeing the wreckage. Arthur relented. They drove up the winding, muddy trail in his heavy-duty pickup truck. The snow was patchy, now revealing the dead brown grass of the dormant mountain. 2 miles up the road, they encountered a high chain-link fence topped with barbed wire cutting entirely across the trail. Large metal signs plastered with bold red lettering warned danger, toxic gases, unstable ground, no trespassing. Arthur parked the truck and they walked to the fence line. Clara gripped the cold chain-link metal, her bandaged hands protesting the pressure. She stared out across the ridge. It looked like the surface of a dead planet. A massive, jagged crater, nearly 50 yards across, dominated the landscape where her front yard and cabin had once been. The edges of the sinkhole were crumbling, dropping tons of earth into the smoldering depths. Thick, sulphurous smoke drifted lazily from the chasm, carrying the acrid stench of burning rock and rot. There was no sign of the porch, the chimney, or the driveway. The earth had simply opened its maw and consumed her entire history. They say it might burn for another century, Arthur said quietly, standing close to her shoulder. The state bought the deed from you at double the market value through the Disaster Relief Fund, but no one will ever build here again. Clara watched a chunk of scorched limestone break loose and tumble into the smoking abyss. It's hungry, she murmured. Pardon, the earth. It's hungry. It took my house, Arthur. It took my past. She turned away from the fence, the smell of sulfur suddenly making her nauseous. But it didn't take me. When they returned to the farmhouse that afternoon, there was a rusty, battered sedan parked in the driveway. Sitting on the front porch steps, his head buried in his hands, was 18-year-old Toby Henderson. As Arthur put the truck in park, Toby stood up. He looked haggard, his clothes unwashed, his eyes red-rimmed and swollen. He shrank back slightly as Arthur stepped out of the truck, the old veteran's posture rigidly unforgiving. "What are you doing here, boy?" Arthur barked his voice, carrying the authority of his military days. Toby swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He looked past Arthur to Clara, who was slowly climbing out of the passenger side. "Mrs. Jenkins, Toby's voice broke. He took his worn baseball cap off and crumpled it in his hands. "I came to apologize." Clara stood by the open door of the truck, the cold wind whipping her gray hair across her face. She looked at the boy who had nearly cost her everything. "I took the money." Toby rushed on the words, spilling out in a panicked, desperate cadence. "I was trying to fix my car and I didn't want to split the logs in the cold, so I just stacked the brush in the back. I thought you'd have enough to get through till the plow came. I never thought the storm would be that bad. I never thought you'd run out." He dropped to his knees in the muddy gravel of the driveway, weeping openly. "I almost killed you. I heard about the fire. If you had died in the cold, it would have been murder. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Arthur took a threatening step forward, ready to run the boy off the property, but Clara placed a bandaged hand on his arm, stopping him. She walked slowly toward the weeping teenager. The anger that had flared in the hospital room was still there, but it was tempered by the bizarre, twisting reality of her survival. She stood over him for a long moment, listening to his ragged sobs. "Get up, Toby," Clara said. Her voice wasn't warm, but it wasn't cruel either. Toby sniffled slowly, getting to his feet, unable to meet her gaze. "What you did was deceitful, selfish, and incredibly dangerous," Clara told him, her tone measured and precise. "You compromised your integrity for a few dollars and an afternoon of comfort. You broke a contract, and out here breaking your word can cost lives." Toby nodded, miserably, fresh tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his face. But Clara continued, taking a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. "The fire marshal told me something very interesting. If you had done your job right, Toby, if my wood stove had been burning hot all week, the coal gas from beneath the cabin would have trapped itself inside. I would have died of carbon monoxide poisoning before the storm ever broke." Toby's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. "What? Your betrayal nearly froze me to death," Clara said softly. "But your laziness is the only reason I didn't suffocate. The draft from the cold saved me." Toby stared at her, entirely incapable of processing the immense paradoxical weight of what she had just said. He was a villain who had accidentally played the savior. "I don't forgive you for lying to me," Clara stated firmly. "Integrity isn't measured by lucky accidents, but I'm not going to press charges for criminal negligence. You are going to carry the weight of what your actions could have done for the rest of your life. Let that be your punishment, and let the fact that I am standing here breathing be your second chance. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am," Toby whispered, his voice trembling with absolute reverence. "Yes, ma'am, I understand." "Then go," Clara said, pointing down the driveway. "Go fix your car, and the next time someone pays you for a cord of wood, you give them a cord and a half." By late April, Pine Bluff finally shed its icy armor. The relentless snowmelt rushed down the valleys, transforming the sleepy creeks into raging, muddy torrents, while the mountainsides exploded into a vibrant, defiant green. Yet for Clara Jenkins, the thaw brought a new bureaucratic nightmare. The State Disaster Relief Board dispatched a senior claims adjuster named Mitchell Branson to assess the damages. Sitting across from Clara at Arthur's kitchen table, Branson adjusted his silk tie and unceremoniously slid a pitifully thin folder across the wood. The state, Branson coldly explained, was classifying the underground coal fire as an act of God compounded by a pre-existing geological hazard. They were offering a meager relocation stipend, barely enough to buy a used trailer in a dilapidated park outside Bozeman. Clara did not weep. She did not yell. Instead, she pushed the folder back across the table. During her weeks of bed rest, Jacob had helped her pull public records from the county archives. Clara presented Branson with a copy of a 1982 State Geological Survey, a documented report clearly showing the Montana Department of Environmental Quality knew the Pine Bluff seam was burning toward the surface decades ago, yet completely failed to mandate residential disclosures or cap the deep earth vents. Faced with the threat of a highly publicized gross negligence lawsuit involving an elderly widow nearly cooked alive on state-ignored land, Branson's smug demeanor vanished. Within 3 weeks, the state cut a settlement check for triple the market value of her original property. The settlement was an absolute fortune by rural Montana standards. Friends from her local parish urged Clara to take the money and flee the wilderness. They mailed her glossy brochures for luxury retirement condominiums in Florida and Arizona, promising eternal sunshine, paved roads, and central heating. They argued she had survived her ultimate trial, and at her age, she deserved an easy life, free of axes, blizzards, and isolation. Clara threw every single brochure into Arthur's fireplace. Instead, she set her sights on a 2-acre plot of untamed woodland directly adjacent to Arthur Pendleton's farm. The land sat at a lower elevation, firmly anchored on solid granite bedrock, completely isolated from the treacherous limestone shelf that harbored the subterranean inferno. The only obstacle was the current owner, a notoriously stubborn cattle rancher named Winston Gable, who had sworn on his father's grave never to subdivide his acreage. It took Arthur driving over with a bottle of 12-year-old scotch and a stern reminder of a life-saving debt Gable owed him from a blizzard back in '88 to break the stalemate. By mid-June, the deed was in Clara's name. Construction began immediately, but Clara's personal rebuilding was far more agonizing. The severe frost nip had caused localized nerve damage in her toes, making prolonged standing a painful pins and needles ordeal. Worse were her hands. The second-degree burns from gripping the scalding crowbar, and the blistering floorboards left her palms slick with raw, highly sensitive scar tissue. Twice a week, Jacob drove her to a physical therapy clinic in town. Clara squeezed hard rubber resistance balls until she wept from the pain, absolutely refusing to let her hands curl into useless claws. She needed her hands. She had a house to build. She hired a local contractor specifically demanding a single-story, heavily insulated timber frame structure designed to withstand absolute zero. The walls were packed with state-of-the-art foam insulation, and she spared no expense, having a high-efficiency geothermal heating system drilled deep into the granite. But the true heart of the home wasn't electric. Clara spent weeks tracking down a specific antique dealer named Leonard Hughes in Missoula. From him, she purchased a fully restored 19th-century cast-iron parlor stove. It weighed 600 pounds and was a masterpiece of thermal engineering. She had the contractors place it dead center in her new living room, sitting on a massive reinforced slab of fireproof slate. "A bit of overkill with the geothermal already running, isn't it?" Jacob asked her one humid afternoon in August, wiping sweat from his brow as they watched the workmen muscle the monstrous black stove into place. Clara gently ran her scarred palm over the cold iron. A machine can break, Jacob. Wires can snap under ice and electrical grids can fail. But as long as you have dry wood and a match, you possess life. I will never, as long as I draw breath, rely on just one single source of heat again. By late September, as the first golden leaves of autumn began to blanket the valley floor, the house was finished. The community of Pine Bluff, desperate for something to celebrate after the brutal winter, threw a massive housewarming party. The newly graveled driveway was packed with dented pickup trucks and mud-splattered SUVs. Neighbors flooded the timber frame house, bringing heavy casseroles, freshly baked sourdough, and bottles of homemade blackberry wine. The most significant gift arrived in the afternoon. Chief Miller pulled up in the department's heavy red brush truck. He and 3 burly firefighters hauled a massive custom-welded steel log rack onto Clara's front porch. Stacked perfectly within it, filling it to the absolute brim, was a full face cord of immaculate kiln-dried seasoned white oak. "Compliments of the station. Mrs. Jenkins." Chief Miller grinned, tipping his uniform cap. "And don't you worry about the rest of the winter. We drew up a roster. Every other weekend, 2 of my boys are going to come up here and make sure this rack is topped off. You will never run out of firewood again, not on our watch." Tears, hot and sudden, pricked the corners of Clara's eyes. She pulled the burly fire chief into a tight hug, overwhelmed by the profound, fiercely protective generosity of the rugged mountain community. Just as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the yard, a rusty, battered sedan crept up the edge of the driveway. The lively chatter on the porch quieted. Toby Henderson stepped out of the car. He looked older, his face leaner, the careless arrogance of youth entirely burned away by guilt. Arthur immediately stiffened his hand, resting aggressively on the porch rail, but Clara stepped forward, signaling for peace. Toby didn't approach the food or the crowd. He opened the trunk of his sedan and carefully pulled out a piece of furniture. It was a rocking chair, meticulously hand-carved from solid cherry wood, polished to a high, flawless gloss. He carried it up the steps, his hands trembling slightly, and set it down gently in front of Clara. "I took a woodworking class at the community college." Toby said, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes fixed firmly on his boots. "I know I can't replace what you lost. I know I can't undo what I did. But I remembered the story you told the police about having to chop up your own rocking chair to burn it. So I made you a new one." Clara looked at the chair. The craftsmanship was stunning, clearly the result of hundreds of hours of painstaking labor. She looked up at the young man, seeing the heavy transformative burden he had carried for the last 8 months. "It's beautiful, Toby," Clara said softly. She reached out with her scarred hand and gently squeezed his shoulder. "Thank you. Now go inside and get yourself a plate of food before the boys from the firehouse eat it all." The immense crushing relief that washed over Toby's face was palpable. He nodded, swiping at his eyes, and finally stepped into the warmth of the house. The final ghost of the winter had been laid to rest. As the evening wound down and the last tail lights disappeared down the dirt road, Clara stood alone on her new back porch. Arthur stepped out a moment later, holding 2 glasses of neat bourbon. He handed her one, the ice clinking softly against the crystal. The night air was growing crisp. Winter was returning as it always did, a relentless cyclical beast. But this time Clara felt no dread. She felt an ironclad sense of readiness. She looked out over the dark, jagged silhouette of the mountains. In the far distance, miles away and high up on the northern ridge, a faint, unnatural orange glow pulsed like a malicious heartbeat against the starry night sky. The Pine Bluff seam was still burning, an eternal underground inferno feeding on the deep earth, venting its toxic breath through the blackened crater where her old life had been entirely consumed. "Does it bother you?" Arthur asked quietly, noticing the direction of her gaze. "Seeing that devil still burning up there?" Clara was quiet for a long time. She took a slow sip of the bourbon, feeling it burn a warm trail down her throat. She looked down at her hands, the pink-healed scars stretching across her palms in the moonlight, permanent physical testaments to the fact that she had reached her bare hands into the fires of hell and pulled herself out. "No." Clara finally answered, a gentle, surprisingly serene smile touching her lips. She took a deep breath of the sharp, clean pine air. "It doesn't bother me at all, Arthur. It reminds me that this world is wild and brutal and completely out of our control." Arthur chuckled softly, a low rumble in his chest. "That's a hell of a comforting thought." "It is," Clara insisted, turning to look back through the glass door into her brightly lit, fiercely heated new home, where her beautiful cherry wood rocking chair sat waiting by the iron stove. "Because it means the only thing we actually can control is how hard we are willing to fight to stay in it. Sometimes, the very thing that seems destined to destroy us becomes the unlikely key to our survival." Clara Jenkins stared down a frozen death at 40 degrees below zero, only to be miraculously and violently saved by a forgotten subterranean coal fire burning directly beneath her feet. It's a chilling reminder that nature plays by its own unpredictable rules, turning a dangerous act of deceit into a bizarre stroke of luck, and transforming a deadly freeze into a protective shield against toxic gas. If Clara's harrowing journey through the frozen depths of the Pine Bluff blizzard kept you on the edge of your seat, Please hit that like button and share this incredible true story with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heart-pounding tales of human resilience and survival against all odds. What would you have done if your floorboard suddenly started to glow? Let us know in the comments below.